Hare Krishna, World Racer, Sabina and Roger here, and let's read chapter number 3 of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes, but before we dive into these wonderful teachings, we must prepare our minds. So let's set an intention that we are seeking to learn and understand this most divine wisdom. Because without any form of grace or the will to seek such wisdom, then we're not going to understand a word. Right? Especially this translation we discovered is quite difficult, even for English speakers.
Before we dive into it, again, we set the stage. We remember that we're on a huge battlefield. And as we found out, there are like millions and millions of warriors present in all kinds of forms, not just humans. Is that right?
Yeah,
not just humans. So, and in the middle is Arjuna with Krishna. And maybe we can really imagine being there and then not just thinking, oh, Krishna is talking to Arjuna. No, Lord Krishna is also talking to you. Arjuna said, Krishna, if you consider knowledge as superior to action, why then do you urge me to this dreadful action, Kesava? You are, as it were, puzzling my mind by these seemingly conflicting expressions. Therefore, tell me the one definite discipline by which I may obtain the highest good.
Sri Bhagavan said, Arjuna, in this world 2 courses of sadhana, spiritual discipline, have been enunciated by me in the past. In the case of the Sankhya Yogi, the sadhana proceeds along the path of knowledge, whereas in the case of the Karma Yogi, it proceeds along the path of action. Man does not attain freedom from action, culmination of the discipline of action, without entering upon action, nor does he reach perfection, culmination of the discipline of knowledge, merely by ceasing to act. Yes, you can't attain freedom from action without entering upon action. You have to perform actions in order to eventually be free of action. So liberation. So we have to perform, duties and functions, and even seeking spirituality and wisdom and knowledge is a form of action, right? So you can't not act. It's not like we're going to get liberated by just surrendering and giving up and doing nothing, right? Surely none can ever remain inactive even for a moment, for everyone is helplessly driven to action by modes of prakriti. And this prakriti means like the modes of material nature. So I've been talking about the modes of material nature to Sabina for years, right? Because to me, it's very much in line with the levels of consciousness, right? So, He who outwardly restraining the organs of sense and action sits mentally dwelling on the objects of senses. That man of deluded intellect is called a hypocrite. On the other hand, he who controlling the organs of sense and action by the power of his will, and remaining unattached, undertakes the yoga of selfless action, through those organs, Arjuna, he excels. Therefore do perform your allotted duty, for action is superior to inaction. Desisting from action, you cannot even maintain your body. Man is bound by his own action except when it is performed for the sake of sacrifice. Therefore, Arjuna, do you efficiently perform your duty, free from attachment, for the sake of sacrifice alone. So this is basically surrendering your actions as a sacrifice. And then when you're in that state where you're just understanding that you don't have any existence outside from God, Krishna, then you can surrender all your actions, and it's like whatever level of consciousness you're at, you're surrendering your actions and being in the state of being surrendered to God. It's going to be more pure action. So that's almost like the divine is flowing through you, right? So it's like a higher level of prakriti, right? So your nature, your mode of material nature has gone up just by surrender alone. Having created mankind along with the spirit of sacrifice at the beginning of creation, the Creator Brahma said to them, "You shall prosper by this. May this yield the enjoyments you seek. Foster the gods through this sacrifice, and let the gods be gracious to you. Thus each fostering the other selflessly, you will attain the highest good." So fostering is the devotion and, the care and wish for the gods. And in this case, I think it's like the gods that we're so dependent on that are part of ancient Hinduism, like the sun, right? And the moon and the rain and the winds, they all have, their own names, right? So when you're performing sacrifice, you're placing your mind and your attention on these, beings, and you're praying, and then you're also developing gratitude and gratefulness. And this helps because everything is an infinite field of consciousness, and our consciousness is part of the field. So whatever we place our attention on, it's beneficial. So then the gods, so doing so is a form of action, that sacrifice, right? Yeah. And then also karma. So action is karma. So then you're going to get, fruits of that. But of course, we don't want to do it just for the fruits. We want to do it for the sake of doing it, right? Fostered by sacrifice, the gods will surely bestow on you unasked all the desired enjoyments. He who enjoys the gifts bestowed by them without offering anything to them in return is undoubtedly a thief. And this is also known in, religion and just dharma in general, is to be grateful for what we're getting. Everything is like a dependent origination. Even the food that we eat, so many people and so many beings, went into that, had to perform action in order for that, to manifest for you to eat. So then you pray for those. The virtuous who partake of what is left over after sacrifice are absolved of all sins. Those sinful ones who cook for the sake of nourishing their bodies alone partake of sin only. All beings are evolved from food. Production of food is dependent on rain. Rain ensues from sacrifice, and sacrifice is rooted in prescribed action. Know that prescribed action has its origin in the Vedas, and the Vedas proceed from the indestructible God. Hence, the all-pervading infinite is always present in sacrifice. So whatever you're doing, whatever you're offering, or whatever you're sacrificing, so God is in everything, right? So we got to keep that in mind, that everything we're doing is, being observed. There's an infinite field of consciousness that we're all a part of. Arjuna, he who does not follow the wheel of creation, thus set going in this world, i.e., does not perform his duties, leads a sinful and sensual life. He lives in vain. So yeah, if you're not performing your dharma and your duties and taking care of what you need to take care of, as part of your responsibility, and you're just after, sense enjoyment, then you live in vain, right? I remember a time before I became spiritual, and I always considered myself a good person, but, it didn't matter. You're still just ignorant, right? So until you start getting in this wisdom, you could go on thinking you're the best person in the world, but really, you're not doing anything meaningful, really, ever. He, however, who takes delight in the self alone and is gratified with the self and is contented in the self has no duty. So this is very much going within and understanding that, there's a consciousness, beyond my ego-thinking mind, and there's a higher source to my very existence, right? And that's where I want to be. That's where I want to go, right? To the highest. And then you've still got to perform actions, but that's like the equanimity that he talked about in chapter 2, right? So just being of stable mind, right? Content. In this world, that great soul has nothing to gain by action, nor by abstaining from action, nor has he selfish dependence of any kind on any creature. Therefore, go on efficiently doing your duty at all times without attachment. Doing work without attachment, man attains the supreme. It is through action without attachment alone that Janaka and other wise men reached perfection. Having in view the maintenance of the world, order too, you should take to action. For whatever a great man does, that very thing other men also do. Whatever standard he sets up, the generality of men follow the same. So setting an example, right? So that's why anybody interested in spirituality, at this time, we got to rise up. We got to raise our level of consciousness. We got to perform our duty, which becomes, what you're doing. You got to be spiritual in the world. If nobody sees that, and if you don't set an example for what a spiritual person should do and look like, which means doing your duty, right? Because a lot of spiritual people, they just want to see the world as an illusion and a delusion, and nothing matters, and then their whole world kind of implodes and they stop doing what they should be doing. And and they think that they're getting more spiritual because they're detaching from everything, but really Krishna says that they're actually, becoming sinful, right? Because they're not doing what they should be doing, right? Like if you abandon your kids and your loved ones and you just go to the mountains and then they're left to like go into child welfare or something like that, but you think you're on a spiritual journey and you abandon your kids, it's probably not a good idea. Stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah. Arjuna, there is no duty in all the three worlds for me to perform, nor is there anything worth attaining unattained by me, yet I continue to work. Should I not engage in action scrupulously at any time, great harm will come to the world. For Arjuna, men follow my way in all matters. So he's the ultimate, right? And whether we know it or not, we're all destined, to become on the spiritual path. So we're following Krishna. We're heading there, whether we know it or not at this point in time, right? So we follow Krishna in all matters. So he's like the highest example of a pure being because he's the source of all pure beings, right? And he's saying that there's nothing for him to do because he's already attained everything, right? Being the highest, but he still has to perform action. If I ever cease to act, these worlds would perish. Nay, I should prove to be the cause of confusion and of the destruction of these people. Arjuna, as the unwise act with attachment, so should the wise man, with a view to maintain the world order, act without attachment. A wise man established in the self should not unsettle the mind of the ignorant attached to action, but should get them to perform all their duties, duly performing his own duties. Right? So being an example, right? So not being pushy and pushing spirituality on those who aren't ready for it, right? So the ignorant that are just, going after sense enjoyment and gratification and all that, but, setting a standard and example so very much for whoever you can influence, which I think it's why it's so important for parents, right? To set a spiritual example for your children. So anybody, who's on the spiritual path and then you have children, then you instill these values into them, right? By leading by example. In fact, all actions are being performed by the modes of Prakriti, primordial matter. The fool whose mind is deluded by egoism thinks I am the doer. So this is very much, how we're programmed by society and our upbringing and our karma and influences and our ignorance, right? Because we're very much in a delusion, an illusion, right? And we're run by the Prakriti, which is, the modes of material nature. So he's going to get into that further, but basically your levels of consciousness, those in the level of ignorance, they're going to be performing actions very differently from somebody at a level of unconditional love, right? However, he who has true insight into the respective spheres of gunas, modes of Prakriti, and their actions, holding that it is the gunas in the shape of the senses, mind, etc., that move among the gunas, objects of perception, does not get attached to them, Arjuna. So you're interacting with sense objects, right? But you're understanding that whatever appears to your perception is just part of the material creation, and you got a higher self, beyond. And then you're not getting, entangled and ensnared and temptation and all of that sort of vice. Yeah. Those who are completely deluded by the gunas, modes of Prakriti, remain attached to those gunas and actions. The man of perfect knowledge should not unsettle the mind of those ignorants of imperfect knowledge. Yeah, so very much just letting everybody be, to their own devices and not going out there forcing spirituality on anybody, because it's the very path of suffering, right? That will eventually lead people to seek the truth. And until they actually seek the truth and declare that for themselves, there's nothing is going to penetrate them anyways, right? So it's better to just don't unsettle their minds. It's okay. Therefore, dedicating all actions to me, with your mind fixed on me, the self of all, freed from desire and the feeling of mume, and cured of mental agitation, fight. Even those men who, with an caviling and devout mind always follow this teaching of mind are released from the bondage of all actions. So surrender your actions unto Krishna.
That's beautiful.
But they, however, who finding fault with this teaching of mind do not follow it, take those fools to be deluded in the matter of all knowledge as lost. All living creatures follow their tendencies. Even the wise man acts according to the tendencies of his own nature. Of what use is any external restraint? Attraction and repulsion are rooted in all sense objects. Man should never allow himself to be swayed by them, because they are the two principal enemies standing in the way of his redemption. Right? So that's like, what is it? Desire and aversion, right? So what you want and what you don't want. One's own duty, though devoid of merit, is preferable to the duty of another well performed. Even death in the performance of one's own duty brings blessedness. Another's duty is fraught with fear, right? So whatever your responsibilities are and whatever chosen, path or career or family life or whatever it is, you got to stay true to that.
Mm-hmm. Now impelled by what, Krishna, does this man commit sin even involuntarily, as though driven by force?
Sri Bhagavan said, "It is desire begotten of the elements of rajas, which appears as wrath. Nay, it is insatiable and grossly wicked. Know this to be the enemy in this case. As fire is covered by smoke, mirror by dust, and embryo by the amyan, so is knowledge covered by desire." Right? So desire gets in the way of, spiritual wisdom and knowledge, because we're just so compelled with our outward focused senses to be engaged in the material reality that we don't realize that, what is the very source of material existence, and we don't ever seek to go beyond it. So we're just living in delusion, right? And Arjuna, knowledge stands covered by this eternal enemy of the wise known as desire, which is insatiable like fire. The senses, the mind, and the intellect are declared to be its seat. Covering the knowledge through these, it, desire, deludes the embodied soul. Therefore, Arjuna, you must first control your senses, and then kill this evil thing which obstructs jnana, knowledge of the absolute, or niguna Brahma, and vijnana, knowledge of sakara, Brahma, or manifest divinity. Manifest divinity. So that's like an enlightened being, right? It's manifest and known. So a high level of consciousness transcended the ego, and that's the main thing that's obstructing it is, desire, right? So you got to control your senses, and conquer desire, and then you can have the knowledge of the absolute. Manifest divinity. Love that. The senses are said to be greater than the body, but greater than the senses is the mind. Greater than the mind is the intellect, and what is greater than the intellect is he, the self. Thus Arjuna, knowing the self, which is higher than the intellect, and subduing the mind by reason, kills this enemy in the form of desire that is hard to overcome. So very much combining knowledge and action, right? So you're using the wisdom and the knowledge of understanding, spiritual truth, very much what he was talking about, in chapter 2, right? So how do we exist, right? The soul, it's imperishable, and then there's a consciousness there, and then now he's getting into the self. So the consciousness beyond the ego thinking mind, right? So that's, the higher self, right? So and it's above the intellect, but you got to use your intellect to be like, okay, I understand how everything's working now, and I understand how my senses, they just want to go out, so I'm going to subdue, my sense gratification, and then be stable in the mind, using the intellect to understand, and then getting into higher states. So the intellect is like a springboard to allow you to be able to even practice karma yoga. Thus, in the Upanishad sung by the Lord, the science of Brahma, the scripture of yoga, the dialogue between Sri Krishna and Arjuna ends the 3rd chapter entitled Karmayoga, or the Yoga of Action.
So I sneaked in this little Gita.
Yeah, so
reading.
we're gonna start supplementing, what we're reading now, the literal translation with a little more poetic, that's easier to understand, right? Because literal we're learning is not the best to understand things. They're using words that I don't even know.
Yeah, we just looked up because here it says the womb hides the embryo, and here is like embryo by the amnion, and Roger doesn't.
I've never even heard of that.
There's so many words that Roger never heard before either, and that means something really.
Yeah, and I'm really good at English. Oh yeah, so the innermost membrane. Oh, the innermost membrane that encloses the embryo of a mammal. Yeah, we really need to know that it's the innermost membrane.
So, as you might have noticed, I have not reacted much because literally this kind of language, putting it in these kinds of words, is just, it's just words to me, most of them, unfortunately. And I really wonder what you guys think. Can you follow the translation? Or is it hard for you? Because we talked about it, we thought, we're going to lose people. Not everybody will make it to the end with this translation.
And I've studied Bhagavad Gita as it is, which I found beautiful and very poetic and incredibly meaningful, and it just hit me. And now this one, it's so difficult to understand that. How is anybody getting any benefit from it? And I understand that it's the most literal translation, but maybe it was, the people who voted for this or wanted it in the comment sections, maybe the Hindi translation.
I thought the same.
The Hindi translation was literal, and it was very, very good.
Yeah.
But the English translation of a literal Hindi translation is very difficult to understand. So I'm gonna give a summary of this chapter, which I've been talking about for years with Sabina, so it'll be very understandable to her. So basically, it's surrendering your actions onto God, right? So that's Karmayoga in a nutshell. And then the reason that it works and it's so valid as a spiritual practice, to attain the divine, is because it's programming your mind to know that it doesn't exist independently, inherently. So that ties into our Buddhist teachings that we're empty. We don't exist independently. There's a power greater than ourselves, right? And that is God. That is Krishna. And that's the self beyond our ego thinking mind. So that's the Buddha nature, right? And without that, there would be no performing of any actions at all. So that's the prime mover. That's the primary cause, because you can't have actions if you don't exist, and you can't exist without consciousness, without the self, right? So when you're surrendering your actions, you're just stating that my ego doesn't exist independently either. And if it wasn't for God, no actions would be performed. So I surrender all my actions onto God, and then it's like God is flowing through you no matter what level of consciousness you're at. So you begin surrendering those actions, and you're automatically purifying yourself, because you're sacrificing your very ego of thinking that it's the doer. So you're like, no ego, you're not the doer. There is a doer that is superior, right? So action is being performed, but it's the modes of material nature. It's the levels of consciousness. By surrendering the actions onto God, you're holding your mind on God, and that's automatically going to elevate you up into the higher and higher levels of consciousness by surrendering your actions, purifying the karma, purifying your mind, because ultimately that's what's operating. We know that this levels of consciousness, which are the programs, the habitual tendencies, the delusions, so influences, right? So your mind, ego mind, is just operating based on programs, so it's reactive. It's going to respond to whatever's happening in the external world, and it's going to react, right? So, and the ego thinks that it's doing all that stuff, but really Krishna is saying that no, it's the gunas, it's the modes of material nature, right? And whatever level you're at, the programming of the mind that is acting. So the ego, it thinks that it's doing those actions, and you can say that it is, like your ego is acting, but that's not you, right? You're the consciousness beyond the ego, right? So then you surrender all the actions, and then that kind of deflates the ego, because you're no longer taking pride. Oh, look at me. I did this. I made that. I made so much money. I'm going to acquire all this wealth and power and glory and me. Because all of that just inflates the ego, which is the delusion. So when you surrender your actions onto God, you're saying that, no, of myself, I can do nothing, right?
Yeah.
So you're always putting God first.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's what the chapter means to me.
I got more out of this than reading this.
And I've been practicing this, since I first read the Bhagavad Gita. I began practicing Karmayoga. Why not? It's the highest teachings. I'm like, I'm going to practice this. So then I would always pray. I surrender all my actions onto God. I surrender all my actions onto Krishna. I surrender all my actions, right? And then I perform actions, and I'm understanding, still performing all sorts of actions, and of course my ego thinks that it's doing all this stuff, but no, I'm surrendered, right? So thank you so much for joining us for Chapter 3, Karma Yoga. Are you guys practicing Karma Yoga, the yoga of action? Want to hear if you guys got any benefit from this chapter. What do you guys think? Was it difficult to understand? Was my interpretation accurate? Let us know. And any tidbits that we might have overlooked or missed.
I'm so depressed that this is so difficult to understand. But please still hit the like button and continue the journey with us, that I don't feel so alone. Please support me.
Yeah, so let us know what you think, and remember, raise yourself
and raise the world. Thank you so much, everyone, and a very special thank you to all our members. We love you.
Peace.